The cabin was cold despite the fire burning in the hearth. Margaret stood at the window, watching the snow fall in sheets across the Wyoming wilderness, her 2 children huddled near the flame. It was November of 1887, and she was utterly, completely alone. Her husband had left 2 weeks earlier, promising to return before winter set in. He had gone to town to sell cattle, to purchase supplies, to handle business. He had kissed her goodbye and said, "I'll be back before the snow." But the snow had come early and heavy, and there had been no sign of him. Margaret was not naive. She had heard the rumors about her husband before they married, that he was a drinker, that he was unreliable, that he had abandoned a previous family when things got difficult. She had believed she could change him. She had believed that love and commitment would be enough to transform a broken man into a dependable husband and father. She had been wrong. The provisions were running low. The wood for the fire was dwindling. And Margaret had 2 children, a son of 5 and a daughter 3, who depended entirely on her to keep them alive through a Wyoming winter. If her husband didn't return, if he had truly abandoned them, Margaret and her children would not survive. She had no one to turn to. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away across deep snow. She had no family in the territory. She had no resources beyond what was in the cabin. She was, in every practical sense, facing the end of her life and the lives of her children. That's when the giant mountain man appeared. Thomas Blackwood was a massive man, 6'4", powerfully built, with the kind of physical presence that made most people step back when he approached. He lived alone in the high country, trapping and hunting, surviving on the margins of frontier society. He was in his mid-40s and had learned long ago not to expect much from the world or from people. He was returning to his cabin after checking traps when he noticed smoke rising from a cabin 2 miles away, a cabin that should have been empty. He was cautious by nature, but he was also curious. And something about the thin, desperate quality of that smoke made him ride toward it instead of away from it. When he approached the cabin and saw a woman at the window, her face hollow with fear and exhaustion, he understood immediately that someone was in desperate need. He knocked on the door carefully, aware that a frightened woman with children might react violently to a stranger, especially one as large and imposing as he was. Margaret opened the door only a crack, her body blocking the entrance, one arm back as if ready to grab something to defend herself. When she saw the giant man standing before her, her expression shifted from fear to something approaching desperation. "Please," she said immediately, her voice breaking. "Please don't hurt us. I have children. My husband will be back soon." Her voice cracked on a lie. "He's coming back." Thomas could see everything in that moment. The fear, the desperation, the lie about the husband, the hollow cheeks that suggested she hadn't been eating properly, the trembling of her hands. And he could see, in the shadows behind her, 2 small faces watching with the terror of children whose world was collapsing. "I'm not here to hurt you," Thomas said, his voice carefully gentle. "I'm your neighbor 2 miles north. My name is Thomas. I saw your smoke. I wanted to make sure everything was all right." Margaret's face crumpled. "Nothing is all right," she whispered. "My husband left. He said he'd be back before winter. But he didn't come back. The food is running low. The wood is running low. I have children, and I don't know how to keep them alive through the winter." Thomas made a decision in that moment that would define the rest of his life. "You won't have to figure it out alone," he said simply. "I'm going to help you. I'm going to make sure you and your children survive this winter. Can I come in?" Over the following days, Thomas transformed the desperate situation into something manageable. He brought supplies from his cabin, food that would last for months, extra blankets, more wood for the fire. He reinforced the cabin against the harsh mountain winter. He taught Margaret how to preserve food, how to manage the fire efficiently, how to ration supplies. But more than that, he became a presence of stability and strength in a world that had become entirely unstable. Margaret's 5-year-old son, who had been quiet and withdrawn since his father's departure, began to come out of his shell when Thomas was around. The 3-year-old daughter, who had been clinging to her mother in desperate fear, began to smile again. Thomas spent his time between the 2 cabins, making sure that Margaret and her children had everything they needed. He brought fresh meat from his hunting. He brought firewood. He brought comfort and reassurance. "Will you leave?" Margaret asked him one evening, as they sat by the fire. It was a question that had been haunting her since he arrived. "Will you abandon us once winter ends?" Thomas looked at her directly, and his expression was serious in a way that suggested he understood the profound weight of what she was asking. "No," he said simply. "I won't leave. I swear to you, Margaret, I will not abandon you or your children. Not in winter, not in spring, not ever. You have my word as a man." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. For the first time since her husband had left, she allowed herself to believe that her children might survive. More than that, she allowed herself to believe that they might actually have a future. The winter was brutal, but Margaret and her children made it through. Not just surviving, but thriving under Thomas's care and protection. And as spring arrived, something unexpected happened. Margaret realized that she had fallen in love with a giant mountain man who would save her life. One afternoon, as Thomas was helping her repair the fence around the property, Margaret spoke words that had been building in her heart for months. "I love you," she said simply. "Not because you saved us, but because you stayed. Because you promised you wouldn't leave, and you kept that promise. Because you've been a father to my children in every way that matters." Thomas set down his tools and turned to face her fully. "I love you, too," he said, "and I want to marry you, not to save you or to make this arrangement official, but because I want to spend the rest of my life with you and your children. I want to be their father, truly, legally, completely. I want them to know that they have someone who will never abandon them." Margaret said yes, and they were married in a small ceremony at the cabin that had been the site of their meeting. And when the preacher asked Thomas if he took Margaret and her children as his family, Thomas responded with absolute conviction. "I do, and I swear before God that I will never leave them, not in good times or bad, not in sickness or health. They are my family now, and I will protect them with my life." Years passed. Margaret's biological father never returned. He eventually sent a letter claiming he had been injured and unable to travel, asking for forgiveness. Margaret read the letter and set it aside. She had moved beyond needing his forgiveness or his explanations. She had a father for her children now, a man who had proven his commitment through years of consistent care and protection. Thomas adopted both children legally, giving them his name, and he became known throughout the territory as a man who had kept his word, a giant mountain man who had sworn he would never leave his family, and who proved it every single day for the rest of his life. When Margaret died at 81, Thomas was at her side. They had been together for 54 years. 54 years of proving that commitment, real commitment, means staying even when things get hard. At her funeral, Thomas spoke about the moment Margaret had pleaded with him not to abandon them, about the moment he had made a vow he intended to keep for the rest of his life. "She asked me not to leave," Thomas said, his voice strong despite his age and grief. "She asked me to promise, and I promised, not because I was a saint, but because I understood something that her first husband never did. That family is not something you leave when it becomes inconvenient. Family is something you commit to completely and permanently. That's what I swore, and that's what I kept. Every day I chose to stay. Every day I chose to be the father my children needed. Every day I proved that my word meant something." He paused, emotion visible on his weathered face. "She asked, 'Don't abandon us.' And I swore, I'll never leave my family. Through 54 years together, I kept that promise. Not perfectly, I'm not a perfect man, but with absolute commitment. That's what love is. Not feelings, not romance. Commitment, showing up, staying, being the person you promised to be." Thomas lived for another 8 years after Margaret's death. He spent those years mentoring young men about what real commitment looked like, about how to be a father, about how promises made to family are sacred and should never be broken. On his grave, 3 names were inscribed: Margaret, her biological son, and her biological daughter. Below them, simple words: Thomas Blackwood. He swore he would never leave, and he never did. And in Wyoming, the Blackwood Legacy Foundation, established to support families abandoned by one parent, to celebrate second families built on commitment, and to honor the men who chose to stay, continued the legacy of a giant mountain man who understood that the greatest strength is not physical, but the moral strength to keep your word to your family every single day for the rest of your life.